Welcome into episode 202 of the Skate Podcast. I'm Brian DeFelice, joined by Bridget Prue and Scott McLaughlin. Bridget and Scott, this weekend, one of my friends asked me. He said, Defa, do you think that next year there's a chance that the Bruins are going to be like the Panthers of this year, where you learn a hard lesson and you come back better than ever? And it was kind of a tough question to answer because from a personnel standpoint, there's just so many unknowns of this team, and it's really tough to gauge like what a team can do in June. But I guess I just kind of said I'll have to see what the roster is, but right now it's a big fat no. I have no optimism in this Bruins team because you know what, guys, they didn't give us reason to be optimistic that they can turn it around. And by the way, Florida's having their own hands full right now to cap off their magical run. So anyway, Bridget and Scott, hope you guys are doing well. But I thought that was a pretty interesting question just because it was kind of a way to maybe spin a negative into a positive. And I think it's a question for Bruins fans to ask themselves this summer. Maybe better days are ahead. But
I didn't know people called you Defa.
Yeah, I was gonna say that's where I want to start. So
yeah.
Scott, we'll think of the same thing there.
Yeah, I guess there's a couple of different variations of my last name that people use, but yeah, it's you guys. It's only Brian with you guys. Don't get any funny ideas, huh?
Okay.
I'm pretty sure even my teachers in high school called me Defa. So, and that's not a fabrication.
You're Defa and Scott's Diva.
Yes, exactly.
Not true. Come on.
That's spoken like a true diva. Anyway, Bridget and Scott, how are your weekends before we dive into the hockey talk?
They were great. It was great. So people watching on YouTube, there's my Manchester City Champions League winners on Saturday.
Congrats.
So that made my weekend. Other than that, not a whole lot. I don't know. Watched game 4 of the Stanley Cup final, but yeah, Brian, that's an interesting question because it kind of dovetails with something that I was thinking that I mentioned to you guys off air, is like the idea that if it were an option for the Bruins to, like if you took the cap out, potential retirements out, like, would you run it back with this team? Or do you think they'd have to make significant changes just because of the first round exit, just because of the disappointment? And my take kind of on both of these is like, I would run it back if that were an option. It's not. We have covered at length all the salary cap stuff and we'll continue to. And I do think if you look throughout history, teams that have these massive disappointments tend to bounce back pretty nicely. Like if you give them a chance, if you don't blow it up. The Lightning in 2018-19 gets swept by Columbus. They bounce back by winning the next 2 Stanley Cups. The 95-96 Red Wings lost to the Avalanche in the Western Conference Finals after their historic season. Bounced back, won the next 2 Stanley Cups. If you want to just keep it to Bruins history, the 70-71 team, until this regular season was the best regular season Bruins team, set all kinds of records. Lost to Ken Dryden and the Canadiens in the first round, bounced back and won the cup the next year. So like there's a lot of history that tells you that, yeah, teams do tend to learn from disappointments like this, and it doesn't guarantee anything, but there's a bunch of these teams that have gone on to win a cup afterwards. Unfortunately, just straight running it back isn't an option for these Bruins. So yeah, I think there are guys on that team that are going to learn from it and grow and be better prepared next time, they're in the playoffs or in this situation or whatever it is. But they just might not have the roster and the talent to be able to make a deeper run and win the cup the way some of those teams in the past have.
I agree with Scott. I mean, when you think about the way that the roster was constructed, especially after the trade deadline, there weren't really holes in the roster. The depth on the defense was incredible. Adding Bertuzzi made the offense more powerful. Even the Hathaway addition made them, like on paper, a tougher team. And you just look at the way things shook out. As long as you don't see a further drop off from Bergeron, Krejci, or Foligno, the older guys on the team, and that they don't become, 80% of themselves, say, next season, or 80% of what they were last year. If they're going to stay at an equivalent health level and skill level and, NHL up to NHL speed, I think that I don't know why you wouldn't run it back. I mean, think about the goalie duo. Goalie duo was one of the best we've ever seen. And, the Bruins are in the position right now to offer Swayman a new contract because he's a restricted free agent. So, though I do believe he'll be coming back, that is another thing that's going on. And then we've talked about the Ullmark. Should you trade Ullmark to free up cap space? There's just so many other complicating things. But if you could do it, I don't know why you wouldn't. And hope that like you said, Brian, that the adversity that they faced and the bitter taste of losing in the first round the way that they did, they could figure a few things out and avoid the same fate.
I think it's definitely an interesting question. I think if you look at the Bruins, and Scott, I know you mentioned the season in the 70s, but 2010, it was a different type of collapse. But I would say that entering the 2011 playoffs for the Bruins, to being that team, in 2010, when the Flyers came back, was that the first time in NHL history that happened? Or was there one time prior?
I think there was one time prior, maybe two. I think there are two prior because I think it's happened 4 times total now. And Kings did it against the Sharks after
a couple years later.
The Flyers against the Bruins,
Well, in any event, like going into that playoff season, the year the Bruins won the Cup, that was a massive, massive black mark on that group the year before, and definitely a massive hurdle to get through in 2011. And they were able to do it in poetic fashion too, like getting a rematch against the Flyers in the second round, going up 3-0, and then finally be able to finish the sweep. But as it pertains to that team, like I would argue that, would you say the Bruins ran that team back in 2011? Because it's interesting, because I feel like maybe 70% of the roster was the same. Maybe 75% of the roster was the same as 2011 from 2010. But they added that group was kept together. But in many ways, they changed a lot of that team in 2011, like adding Nathan Horton, adding Gregory Campbell, adding Rich Peverly and Chris Kelly. The goaltending scenario was different in 2011. You went with Timmy Thomas over Tuukka Rask from the year before. So it was
still the same duo, though. Like I remember the year before in 2010, there was a lot of like back and forth between, okay, who's your number one? Like like you said, they went back and forth with it. So
they did, but I guess what I'm saying is, anytime there's an epic collapse like there was in 2010, like there was this year, I just don't think you can run back. Even if you could, I still think you got to make changes, because the group failed, and you can keep a lot of that group together if you're able to. But I think the Bruins, if they had the cap flexibility to run it back, I'm not so sure I would. I would sit there and say, you know what, we'll keep most of them together, but we got to make some changes here. Because if you run it back the same personnel, if you could, and you fail again, well, then you have yourself to blame. So it's definitely an interesting question. It's not as objective. I think it's more of a subjective question, and it changes team to team. But I think change is needed, even if you couldn't keep everybody again.
I would put it this way, though. Like in the playoffs, we didn't get to really look consistently at the group that they had and the way that it should have been arranged, right? Like there were games where Krejci was missing. There were games that Bergeron was missing. They had rearranged the first line to put Bertuzzi on it. They had moved pieces all the way around where maybe they shouldn't have been. They took Grzelcyk out certain games. Like they didn't have enough consistency in the playoffs for us to really see what that potential could have been. And on top of it, you're dealing with a goalie that wasn't 100%. So you can say what you want to say about them mishandling that this year, but theoretically, if we're talking when everyone is healthy, we didn't see what that could look like yet.
Yeah, and so I guess like when I say run it back, like realistically, like I don't mean like the entire exact same roster, just because like that never happens with any team. So there would be some changes. I guess I mean more like the core, I wouldn't say like the top 7 players on the roster or whatever. Like I wouldn't change that. But yeah, there would always be changes around the edges. And you're right, like the Bruins from 2010, that off season. Yeah, Nathan Horton was the big one. And then there was another big one in season when they trade away Blake Wheeler and get Kelly, Peverley, like all that. So yeah, like there's always changes, and those ones definitely helped them win the cup and go further than they had the year before. So like there would be some change somewhere, but I absolutely like if they would keep this core together. And they, depending on how you define the core, like they can still potentially keep most of it. Like if Bergeron decides to return for cheap money, then you can run back like most of this. Yeah, you're gonna lose some free agents, and you're gonna have to turn over, say, like your 4th line for sure. But you can keep like a lot of this group together, and like I'm not trying to like start a war with our afternoon show, but we've
already started one.
Yeah, we've referenced them. They referenced Arcan talked about us on Saturday.
And by the way, we like everybody on that show. We weren't trying to. We're just participating in the debate.
But like I'm just using them as an example, and like they're not alone of like wanting to change and like turn this page to the next era. And like, okay, yeah, they understand, if Bergeron wants to come back for $2 million, you kind of have to keep him. But like that there almost seems to be like, with them at least, like this sense of maybe there'd be like some relief if if he and Krejci do retire, and you can finally start to like look at what the next era of Bruins hockey is going to be. And I just think like there's going to be a ton of time for that. Like we're going to see it at some point anyways. But if Bergeron wants to come back, like, yeah, you try to make another run at it. And yes, your opening night roster is not going to be as strong as the roster that ended this year, but you're going to be a playoff team, and you see where you are come deadline time. You try to find a way to get hot towards the end of the season and go into the playoffs on a high note. Like as we've seen, where you finish in the regular season really doesn't matter. It's kind of all about how you're playing once the playoffs get here. So, yeah, I guess that's my long way of saying, like, I don't think they need like huge changes because of the collapse, and the idea of keeping most of this together, as much as possible, I don't think is a bad plan. Like, I think that, giving this group a shot to kind of redeem themselves is a pretty good plan, because a lot of teams have done it. And, I think like there's enough character in that room that like you can give these guys a chance to do it, and they may very well respond very positively.
And one lesson that I've learned, I guess, this postseason, and I think I knew it all along, but you still in the moment you still get deceived. Like there's a difference between a Stanley Cup roster on paper and a Stanley Cup team on the ice. And of course, this past spring when the Bruins were assembling a dream team, it seemed like in the modern era, given the hard cap and whatnot, like in the back of my mind, I was like, this could blow up in their face. Like it's going to be a ton of expectations, and they might lose. But I was like, screw it. Like I want to see all these unreal players in the same sweater for the Bruins in the same postseason. Like I know I know that the chemistry hasn't had a chance to develop player 1 to player 23 since the trade deadline. I knew there was some kinks to figure out, but I still thought they were good enough too. I knew they weren't playing fantastic going into the playoffs, but I thought they had enough talent and depth to kind of get through some of those early hiccups, and I was wrong. But like to your point, Scott, like the Bruins roster opening night next year will not be as good on paper as it was when they got eliminated in Game 7. But the lesson I've learned is like it doesn't need to be. Like how many times does the best roster win the cup or go to the finals? And it's like the Bruins roster.
The Avs were pretty.
Yeah, the Avs last year. You know what? That's a good point. I would say the last couple of 2-3 years, and maybe even this year with Vegas, right? Like, yes, like Tampa Bay for a couple of years in a row had the best roster, undisputed. Same with Colorado, I think last year. And Vegas, outside of Boston, had the deepest roster, I would say, in the NHL this year, and they're a game away from winning the Cup. So, yes, like there are examples of that happening, but more often than not, it's a team that just kind of goes on a run and has the right pieces in place, but the borderline players, they can fluctuate. And like the Bruins in 2019, their roster was not as good as their roster was this year on paper, but they were a game away from a Stanley Cup. So, like, going into next year, if Bergeron comes back, I guess what I'm saying is, like, you don't need to have the all-star roster, on paper that they had this year. You just need to have enough of the right players, enough of the right pieces, and then, have some, like, maybe you don't have the ideal fourth line center of Thomas Nosek, but you know what? Maybe you substitute like a young, hungry, John Beecher or somebody like that, or Mark McLaughlin, and like, so. And maybe you won't have the expectations going into next playoffs if they get there, and maybe that's just what they need. maybe that's why there's a commonality of these teams that have these big playoff mishaps, and then they come back next year because not only is there a chip on their shoulder, but no one has the expectations they had the year before. And I still hate the fact that the Bruins let expectations and outside noise get to them this year, because Cam Neely pretty much said that a lot creeped into the room. I still hate that excuse, but you know what? If it's reality, it's reality, and it is what it is. So, yeah, I don't know. I would definitely, if Bergeron wants to come back, I guess if that's the question, like if Bergeron wants to come back, like we talked about last week, of course, welcome him back. And if he doesn't come back, well, then we'll have some options, and we'll talk about those later, because Scott did write up a nice little article. But Bridget, any final thoughts on that?
Just that if we're talking about running like a majority of it back and just assuming that Krejci isn't on there, but if Bergeron is, Pavel Zacha is a great center. Like, so first replacement comes from within with Zacha. We saw him playing center towards the end of the season in the playoffs a little bit, but I mean, for a majority of that season, he was a winger, and he was able to pretty seamlessly transition. And it's not that easy to go from playing wing to being a team's number one center in the playoffs. So I thought that with the small sample size that we saw, he's a very capable replacement as a second line center for Krejci, if that's what you need. Now it's much more difficult to replace 1 and 2 centers. So if we want to transition though into what you were writing, Scott, about some external options to add at center that could be available, including some familiar names that we've heard come up at the trade deadline this year and last year, some free agents that you are planning on putting the article out tomorrow morning, which this is probably going to come out right around the same time. So by the time you're listening to this, I'm sure Scott will have it out.
Yeah, and this is all prefaced with everything we've covered already this offseason, which is, yes, the Bruins don't have a lot of cap space. They can't do a lot. Like, if Bergeron and Krejci retire, they might just have to roll with what they have, because they can't pull off a move for another top 2 center. Like, got all that, but let's, look forward a little bit and play the game of, all right, what if they do decide to target a top 2 center and try, see what's out there and try to find that guy this offseason? And because there could be some options out there. And the biggest name right now is definitely Pierre-Luc Dubois, who Pierre LeBrun of TSN reported this over the weekend, that he has told the Winnipeg Jets that he has no intention of signing a long-term extension with them. He's a restricted free agent. So if you have the Jets, like, they could play hardball with him and go to arbitration and get him back for another year. But why would they do that? Like, they're most likely going to trade him and cash that chip now and get what they can for him. He's only 24, soon to be 25. Has top 60 points the last 2 years. Has size, 6'4", 214 pounds. Like, we've seen that he'll use it. People might remember last year he was the one who had the hit on Matt Grzelcyk that caused the shoulder injury that ended up bothering Grzelcyk the entire rest of the season, and that he ended up needing surgery on after the year. There have been some questions about like Dubois' effort in Columbus when he forced to trade out of there. He like very clearly had just given up at the end and was taking shifts off and floating around. And that's cropped up a couple times in Winnipeg too. I think that's been an issue with the whole team in Winnipeg, but I think, if Dubois is available, and it certainly seems like he's going to be, like, you have to at least take a look. I have my doubts about whether the Bruins are the team that's going to be able to, put together the package to land him. But, a mid-20s center who's already put up multiple 60-point seasons, who can score 30 goals, like, those guys aren't available very often. And if you can get him and sign him to an extension, like, that just took care of, a huge long-term need.
And for him, though, of your list, he seems like one of the guys that would probably be fetching, like, you'd have to send more out than with some of the other guys on this list. First of all, some of them are free agents, so obviously that doesn't require a trade, but this one would be requiring a trade with Winnipeg. And I know, Scott, one of the things that you mentioned about him is that Winnipeg might not necessarily be looking for what the Bruins have to offer, right? A Taylor Hall, they probably don't want a Taylor Hall. Do they need Allmark? No. So what the Bruins have to offer is a little bit differently. Obviously, they already have a good goalie up there, so that takes maybe your best
for now.
And Winnipeg we've heard a lot of things about, like, people just not wanting to play for Winnipeg. We've never really heard the full background story as to what makes guys kind of just not mesh with whatever they're doing there.
I think it's because they're in Winnipeg.
I was going to say that. I was going to say I've always wanted to be an NHL play-by-play broadcaster, but if I got offered the job in Winnipeg, don't know if I would take it. So that might have something to do with it too. And in terms of his age, do you find that maybe it would be an issue? I mean, obviously, great. You want somebody that's young in the first half of their career. But if, say, you're replacing Bergeron with Pierre-Luc Dubois, these are two incredibly different personalities. And if you're just going to plug him right in there with Marchand and DeBrusk, obviously Marchand would be the veteran on that line, and it would probably be fine. But if we're talking about somebody with a very, very different personality than Patrice Bergeron, I wonder the fit there.
Yeah. I mean, Scott, do you want to comment on the fit? You seem like you're chomping at the bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think, bringing in anyone from the outside is going to be a question about fit, but I like the fact that he's young, and, in my mind, I'm thinking, like, you can still kind of mold, like, especially if Marchand's still around, and kind of your next captain. And that's another thing I should clarify is, like, this is all assuming Bergeron and Krejci are both.
Scott. So I'm going to finish the sentence. Assuming Krejci and Bergeron are both gone, that's what this list was that Scott made, because then you're really in trouble. So you're going to have to look for outside answers if they're both gone. I'm just going to, while we wait for Scott, bring up another name, Brian, on this list. And so Mark Scheifele, another name out of Winnipeg. So that seems like, a transition here for us. Keep it with the same team. He is older, but he's been a good NHL player for a long time. So maybe, do you think the fit would be a little bit better with someone like Mark Scheifele?
It's I don't love the idea of Mark Scheifele defensively. So I don't know. I would probably take the chance more on Dubois just because of the age and moldability, I suppose. Scheifele, I don't know. It's just one of those situations where if Bergeron goes, you're losing such a defensive-minded player. I just don't see Scheifele coming in and being a net positive for them, even though he's younger, has more offensive upside at this point in his career. But whereas, like, Dubois, like, I could just see, because he's 24, and Scott was mentioning that earlier, you do have that luxury of timing. I just have a hard time wrapping my brain that the Bruins could trade for somebody like Dubois, because we mentioned, like, Hellebuck doesn't seem to be wanting to stick around Winnipeg. So that need for Ullmark could be there for them for sure. But besides Ullmark, I just don't see what the Bruins have to offer. They have no first or second round draft picks this year or next. And in fact, like that's kind of like, and that's the first thing I think of when I think of the Bruins needs this offseason. Like for me, it's like, can you shed some salary cap on this current roster and bring back some draft picks for many reasons. Number one, for your own cupboard. Maybe you want to draft your own center down the line, right? Or maybe you want draft picks so that you could insert them into a trade package. I just feel like right now the Bruins just don't have much to package together. But I guess that may be a conversation for a few minutes from now. But because you asked about Scheifele, I guess my answer, I guess I'm out on Scheifele. I just without too many details, I just
he's
think
30 and his contract would be rather large. If you think about it, when you put it that way, like when you think about the state of Winnipeg, where they might be in this season or next season, if they lose Scheifele, Dubois, and Hellebuyck, they're in full rebuild and they're collecting picks. You know, they're not messing around with some of the stuff the Bruins have to offer. But Scott, while you were away, we were talking about Mark Scheifele.
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of with Brian in terms of like, I don't love Scheifele's game. The offense is obviously great. He's been over 60 points 8 straight years, very consistent. Just put up 42 goals, a career high. Like, you know, you're getting high end offense from him, but you get almost no defense. There's been plenty of questions about his effort. There's been questions about the entire Winnipeg leadership core, and he's part of it. You know, he's worn an A the last few years, so you don't love all that. And you're right. He has 1 year left, so he would have to get a new contract. And is that really a guy you want to be locking up into, his mid to late 30s and kind of hitching your wagon to? I would have serious questions about it, which is why I would rather have Dubois, because, I guess you kind of hope like whatever's going on in Winnipeg or even Columbus before that, like, hasn't tainted him too much. And, he could still come into a better organization with better leadership, more stability, obviously more commitment to defense, and still develop because he's still young. So yeah, I would take my chances with Dubois if the right deal was there. But as you guys said, like, the Bruins have so little that they can throw into a deal, like, blockbuster trade like that, where it's like, all right, if Winnipeg's going to be rebuilding, they want picks, prospects, young players who are like, on the verge of contributing, and the Bruins don't have the picks. They don't have very many elite prospects at all. And, young players that could maybe be attracted to Winnipeg. It's like, well, if they trade Connor Hellebuyck, I'm sure Jeremy Swayman would be very attractive to them. But are you trading Swayman for Dubois? I think that's really interesting. I think finding centers is harder than finding goalies. So I don't totally dismiss that idea out of hand. But, that'd be a tough one for the Bruins to make. Like, I'm sure they would, they'd be very hesitant to do that.
And just to make a point, because I'm a college hockey nerd, that would be one Mike Richter trophy winner to another, because Hellebuyck was the first to win the Mike Richter Award in college hockey, which is the best goalie in college hockey. And then Swayman won it the last year that he was with Maine. They both of them with Hockey East, because Hellebuyck won it with UMass Lowell. Yeah.
Hellebuyck was the best goalie I've seen in college hockey since I started following it. He was so dominant. It was insane.
We still talk about him on our I've talked about him on my broadcast this year because I covered a lot of UMass Lowell. He still comes up quite a bit.
Yeah. And his record at the Garden was like unreal. Like, I think he was 4-0 because they won the Hockey East title both of his years there. And he like gave up like 3 or 4 goals total or something. It was like biggest stage. He was just lights out. And now he's been stuck in Winnipeg on bad teams either. Well, not all bad teams. Like, they've had some good teams there, but for the most part, nothing that's been like a serious cup contender. And which is why it looks like they're kind of going to blow up this core now. So
yeah, I don't know what the quality of life is in Winnipeg. Maybe if we have anyone that's watching or listening to this, let us know what it's like living there, because like on a day-to-day, what do you do in Winnipeg? That's what I want to know. When you go from living, near Boston, near the ocean, near a bunch of stuff.
That episode of SpongeBob when he has to write an essay and just puts the word "the." Yeah, I think that's probably what there is to do in Winnipeg. So, the next person on this list, I find very interesting. And Scott, I'll let you paint the scene because, of course, you wrote this. But I'll just say that in the spirit of, and again, this is another person who you'd have to trade for. So it's like I just don't, that'd be the toughest part. But assuming that the Bruins could trade for this player, I think of all the players that Scott has in this piece, this would be the best player, I think, as far as bridging the gap from how Bergeron played. He's in his prime and just his style of play and overall caliber of play. This person would fit their short and long-term needs, and I think would solve a lot of issues for Boston. The question is, could they acquire him?
Yeah, so this is Elias Lindholm with the Calgary Flames. No relation to Hampus. But Lindholm's entering the final year of his contract. He's 28. He's going to be an unrestricted free agent after this coming season. And the Flames have a new general manager, Craig Conroy. And in like his introductory press conference, he was asked about Lindholm because, his name's kind of been out there, what's going to happen with him. And he said he's a player that you want to build around. So he wants to keep him. His priority would be signing him to an extension. But another interesting comment he made is he also said he doesn't anticipate making the same mistake the Flames made with Johnny Gaudreau, which was taking it all the way to free agency. And ultimately they lost Gaudreau for nothing. He just walked. So that would tell you that if there's any hesitation on Elias Lindholm's part to sign an extension or to want to wait until after the season, you would assume that means that Calgary would look into trading him. Like if Craig Conroy's saying he doesn't want to lose big name free agents for nothing, then that's your only other option. So potentially could be available depending on how their extension talks go. And yeah, I think a player can do it all. He had a career year 2 years ago, 2021-22. 42 goals, 82 points. He finished second in the Selke Trophy voting behind Bergeron. So his numbers took a hit this past year, including his defensive metrics, and that's because he didn't have Matthew Tkachuk on his wing. Like that's a big loss, and there's no question that Tkachuk was a huge reason that he had his career year when he did. So I'm not paying that price for him. Like I'm not paying for his career year, knowing that he benefited a lot from playing with Tkachuk and Gaudreau, by the way. They were all on the same line. Like that line was insane that season. But if his value matches, what he has been without those guys, then I still think he's a very good player. And you would have him, basically through the second half of his prime. So I would say he definitely excites me more than Scheifele. And, it's probably right about on the same level as Dubois, even though he's, a little older. But, yeah, you're right. Like, he would be more of a like-for-like fit if you're looking for someone who's still going to, he's not Bergeron, but who still brings some defensive responsibility.
Well, yeah, if you look at where he finished in the Selke Trophy voting, he's right there with Bergeron. I mean, there's been years where it's clearly been Bergeron, but when you're talking about the same style of player, Bergeron's a consistent Selke Trophy winner and, candidate. And you're talking about someone that is up for, essentially the award that means you play a similar style as Bergeron. Like all those guys are playing that defensive two-way hockey. So yeah, to your point, Brian, that you can just see that he would have a good fit there. I'm not really sure personality wise how he is, but I feel like he's kind of a subdued, under the radar kind of person. And that could make him an easy plug-in with anyone really, but if you say put him on the first line with Marchand and DeBrusk, I feel like he could be a good fit there. But the reason why he's such a good fit is because he's probably a little bit out of your reach in terms of trying to get him. Scott, I saw that you put in your notes that Calgary might be a little bit better of a trade partner than Winnipeg would be. And would you just explain a little bit about why?
Yeah, because so another part of Craig Conroy's comments is he doesn't sound like he has any intention of going into full rebuild. It seems like he wants to remain competitive, be a playoff team, try to build the next cup winner from like what they have. And so maybe they're a little more open to taking on NHL contracts. Now, you're still probably gonna have to throw in more. Like I don't think you're gonna get Elias Lindholm for Taylor Hall straight up, let's say. Like I think there's still gonna have to be like a pick or prospect in there somewhere, but they might be more willing to kind of have, an NHL contract be part of the deal and sort of build around that. Whereas Winnipeg, it certainly seems like they're going into like a full rebuild where, as we said earlier, like they're not going to have any use for a Taylor Hall or a Matt Grzelcyk, and Calgary might. Like that they have a similar situation with Noah Hannafin on defense, and obviously we know he's been linked to the Bruins before. But kind of the same idea going into the last year, are they going to sign him to an extension or try to move him now? So, yeah, if the Flames want to remain competitive, then they're probably looking at something like the deal that they made with Tkachuk, where, it's not going to be that big of a deal. Like Lindholm's not as good as Tkachuk, but they wanted NHL pieces for Tkachuk. They didn't want picks and prospects. So they might be looking at something similar with Lindholm, and that is more in line with like the kind of deal that the Bruins would probably be looking to make.
Yep. And also just looking at Bergeron and his stats over the years, interestingly enough, because you mentioned Lindholm, I think you said 82 points, right? Bergeron's career high in points, for what it's worth, is 79. And it was in 2018-19 when they went to the finals. And beyond that, like we know Bergeron's a first ballot Hall of Fame player, and he's only cracked 70 points 3 times over his, I want to say 19 season career so far. So I guess what I'm trying to say is it's not like you're relying on Bergeron for 100 points a year, right? You rely on him for two-way play. And that's exactly what Lindholm brings. Does he bring it as much on the defensive end as Bergeron? No. But you know what? Nobody in NHL history really has. So, I mean, there's a couple guys. Bergeron's on he's on a Mount Rushmore of two-way forwards, honestly, in the league's history. So, not only like it's just you don't need that because no other team has that either. Like, there's only one Bergeron, right? So,
that would cause such a conundrum for Jack, like broadcasting so that would cause such a conundrum for Jack broadcasting a game where there's 2 Lindholms. Just like, I broadcast games where there's brothers, and it's like you have to say the full name now. Like you have to say the full thing, otherwise, who has the puck? So
Jack's
And like I mentioned, Lindholm's numbers dipping this year because he didn't have Gaudreau and Tkachuk on his wings. He still had 64 points, so still like a really solid season even without those guys. And I'm looking at okay, who did he play with this year? His most common line mates this year were Tyler Toffoli and Dylan Dubé. So, like he played some with Jonathan Huberdeau, who had a down season anyways, but Huberdeau spent more time with Nazem Kadri. So, still a solid season with wingers that I think are worse than what he would have in Boston. Like, whichever line you put him on or a combination of wings, like either he's got he almost certainly has at least one of Pasternak or Marchand on his line, and then fill in, a DeBrusk or Hall or Bertuzzi if he's back or whatever. And like, he's going to have better wings than he did this past season in Calgary.
That's a good point too, Scott. Like I could see him being and this is semantics, what line you call your first line at this point, but like being on the line with Pastrnak rather than the line with Marchand, because I think that like 1-for-1, Zacha is actually a really decent comp to Bergeron as well, because he is a good two-way center. And he's mentioned before that the player that he modeled his game after was Bergeron when he was growing up and when he was developing. So I actually don't mind Zacha in that spot, in Bergeron's spot with DeBrusk and Marchand, where he did play in the playoffs when they started things out without Bergeron. So if you want to put, like, playing through this hypothetical, if you had Elias Lindholm and you could put him with Pasta, that's a great line.
Totally. And it's a reminder that this time last year we were talking about, man, the Bruins are gonna have to replace Bergeron and Krejci. Like, if those two guys retire, completely rebuild. But yeah, it's one of the nuances we haven't really talked about ad nauseum. But Don Sweeney did address one of those centers of the future last year in Pavel Zacha, and everybody on this podcast, I think he won the 7th Player Award, so Bruins fans agree too. Like that's why that last year. And I found people to be a little disingenuous when they were like, oh, I can't believe people were calling for the Bruins to rebuild last year. Well, look, last June, we didn't know about Bergeron and Krejci coming back. So you literally had your number 1 and number 2 centers not on a roster. Even if, like, right now, even if Bergeron and Krejci both retire, and I think we all think Krejci's probably done anyway, but you at least have one of your 2 top centers of the future. And I think Zacha is not just a number 1 and number 2 center of the future. I think he's a damn good number 2 center at least. So, like, this year there is more optimism because we really are just trying to find that one if Bergeron were to go. And that's what this article that Scott's posting is about, if Bergeron goes. And I think Lindholm would be the most like for like person, like Scott, I think you put it. So any other closing thoughts on him? Do you want to keep moving down this list? Because there are some other interesting names that we can definitely spoil.
Might as well keep going unless you guys had any closing thoughts there. But next one, keeping us in Western Canada.
This has all been Western Canada so far.
Yeah, good place to shop. Great resources in Western Canada. JT Miller, who is just always in trade rumors. Even though he signed a 7-year extension before this past season, he was still in trade rumors leading up to the trade deadline. And, he's averaged over a point per game over the last 4 seasons. Things did seem to go better once Rick Tocchet took over as head coach in Vancouver. You didn't hear about quite as much dysfunction, but before that, Miller was kind of at the center of it. Like, there were, we talked about Dubois and like questions about his effort at times. Like, there were pretty clear shifts where JT Miller just like did not give a shit and like was not engaged. And you don't love that. You don't love seeing that from anyone. But when JT Miller is playing and trying, he is a damn good player. And, another guy he's not elite defensively. He's never going to win a Selke, but I do think he can play defense. Like he's not Scheifele. And Vancouver is just, it's unbelievable. Do you know who has the least amount of cap space in the NHL right now? It is the Vancouver Canucks. Like, for a team that is that bad to have, they're technically over the cap right now. It's insane. I'm like, I cannot believe how badly that team has been mismanaged. But they have to move money somewhere. And, there's plenty of candidates. Brock Besser's name always comes up as well. Connor Garland, like, a bunch of guys, but certainly JT Miller's name, I think, could pop up again, just because it seems like he's never really happy there, even after signing an extension. And, he's played a lot of center and a lot of wing. Obviously, the Bruins would be looking at him as more of a center. So yeah, I don't know if they can get him, but he's a guy that the Bruins have been linked to before, have reportedly had interest in. So if he's available, I think like it makes sense that they would at least be checking in again. If they've been interested in the past.
Yeah, and so one of the other interesting parts of this, and Scott, you mentioned that the Canucks are kind of in a desperate situation, you could say, because of the bad moves that they've made in the situation they find themselves in with the cap. And the interesting thing was that extension, and now he has a no trade clause that is going to kick in. What is it, this July?
Yeah, July 1st.
Okay, so we're talking about, as we're recording right now, like a few weeks from now. So less than a month from now, he has a no trade clause that will kick in, and that will obviously tie Vancouver's hands in the teams that he's able to go to, or if he wants to leave at all. So, yeah, that makes it more complicated for sure in terms of where they can send him and the package they can get. So if you're looking to really move that cap, and he's the guy you're thinking, okay, well, he's probably reached his ceiling here. He doesn't really care, or we don't feel we're getting the full effort. Maybe he's just not a fit here. Maybe he'd better be a better fit somewhere else. And we see this as an opportunity to kind of get right with the cap a little bit. You want to be able to get what you can, and that does make it more urgent to get that deal done. If you're going to get it done this offseason, it makes more sense to get it done this month in June before July rolls around.
For me, they just seem like the most unfit trade partners for each other at this time. Just because of each team having a very, very similar problem. And I don't know if the Bruins want to, put a ring on Miller's finger for the rest of his contract. I just don't think he's what they might need. They want. I mean, the Bruins, if they could find the best case scenario for them is finding a short and long term solution at the same time. And I feel like I just feel like they would regret that Miller contract. I mean, it might help them in the next couple of years and keep the owners happy and keep the Bruins competitive. But for me, and like, this is a great article for Scott to write, and it's good to just keep the brains, thinking and stuff like that. But like, the biggest thing for me is the Bruins just don't seem like a great trade partner for a lot of teams right now. Like, I think the Bruins, they have to trade one of Ullmark or Swayman. I don't like whichever one gets you the most value. And I mean, you can make an argument for either one, right? The argument for Ullmark bringing you the most value is that he's going to be coming off of a Vezina trophy, and he's 29 years old, and that's peak value right there in the NHL. Jeremy Swayman's case would be youth, right? He's definitely shown.
And if you are good at evaluating goalies, you can see the potential right there. It's not like it's not like you're like taking a risk with him, right? He seems like a kind of a sure thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so I just think that when you're the Bruins, like, that's clearly they don't have a lot of ammunition in the trade package category, but what they do have is two number one goaltenders in the NHL, and if you hoard both of them, it's just irresponsible, because if you're trying to figure something out here, you got to be willing to move on from one of them, and I don't know. So like, when you take away moving one of Swayman or Ullmark, to me, it's like, if they're off the table, I don't know what's going to be a center of a package like. So for me, like, a big caveat here for all these players, especially the non-free agents, of course, would be, can the Bruins swing a deal? And for me, it starts with one of those two goalies being a part of it, because you don't have the draft picks to include unless you want to send me your 2030 first round pick. But
you're right though. Like, the Canucks, they're not really a 1-for-1 match because of both teams trying to clear money. So if you're the Bruins, it's like you would have to make another trade first, get picks, prospects, whatever they want, and then turn around and do it. You're probably not doing that by July 1st. But I don't think that means like Miller has to be dealt by then necessarily, because if he doesn't want to be in Vancouver, or they don't really want him or whatever, like, from Vancouver's perspective, they would want to make the trade before then, because then every team is on the table. Theoretically, they can move him anywhere. but like you could still potentially work with him to find, okay, can you give us a list of a few teams you would accept a trade to type thing.
But
So it's
even
not
slowly,
impossible. It's just unlikely because then if you're the Canucks, you're really limited because now you can only talk to the teams that he wants you to talk to.
Yeah, and that looking back on just as another example of a team that was in that situation, Buffalo with Taylor Hall did not get probably a return that they could have because Taylor Hall had a no move clause and was picking between, I think, maybe 3 or 4 teams. And
I think it was pretty much just one. He really wanted to go to the Bruins, and
I think he really wanted to go to the Bruins. I think there were offers. There were offers from other teams that were probably better, but his mind was made on the Bruins. And so what does Buffalo get? They get Anders Bjork. And so that's just an example of why Vancouver would want to expedite the process in terms of what they could get in return, though it doesn't mean that they can't move them after that point. But is there anything else you guys want to say about JT Miller before we move to the final 2 guys on this list?
No, I think we covered Miller.
Okay. Go ahead, Scott.
Well, so we haven't touched on any free agents yet, and that's because there aren't a lot of top 2 centers who are free agents. Probably the most notable one is Ryan O'Reilly, who obviously Bruins fans know well. Beat you in 2019, won the Conn Smythe Trophy that year, had 9 points in the Stanley Cup final. That was 4 years ago. He's older now. He's 32. He's not quite the same player, but he was still pretty good in Toronto after they traded for him this season. 11 points in 13 regular season games, 9 points in 11 playoff games. The Leafs don't end up going on a deep run, but he certainly seemed to bring what they were looking for. Now, he was playing basically a second line role in Toronto. I think he can still handle them. Like if your top 2 centers are him and Pavel Zacha, I think O'Reilly can still handle the minutes where it's like, yeah, he's probably not going to be like a true number 1 workhorse center who's going to look like he did in his prime at this point. But I definitely still think he can handle a top 6 role for sure. And it would just come down to what kind of deal he's looking for. Like, I don't know. Is he open to something shorter term because he wants to go to a cup contender? Or is he looking to cash in on a longer term thing, towards the end of his career? Does he want to go back to St. Louis? Because that was another thing that, I think he even made like a comment along those lines at some point that he'd be open to a return to the Blues. So maybe he already has his mind set on that. But yeah, I think he's still a good player. And if the Bruins are looking for something shorter term, get a guy for 3 years, say, he makes sense. I personally, I don't think this is the direction the Bruins would go. I think, if they're adding a center from the outside, I think they're probably going to want it to be someone a little younger. But like, what do you guys think of the idea of potentially targeting O'Reilly as a free agent?
I of this list so far, this is my least favorite. However, it's probably the most doable. And also, it's pretty hard to argue that he doesn't fit the Bruins mentality. Like, this is a guy that can do, a little bit of everything. He's a tough guy. We've seen what he was like in the Stanley Cup final in 2019. He has the championship mentality. He has kind of that Kachuk style mentality where, he's willing to do anything to help his team. And he just has that kind of killer instinct. So in that way, personality wise, you could argue would be a decent fit for the Bruins. 32 is not that old to add him right now. However, there's obviously the backstory of that, the bitter taste in people's mouths still here in Boston of him lifting the cup on your home ice and, having him be such a pain in that series. Now, obviously, Bertuzzi was somebody that was a pain to the Bruins side when he was with Detroit and everybody liked him when he came over. Maybe that's the same situation with O'Reilly. Him being a free agent makes it, makes the decision just about his contract. You don't necessarily need to worry about all those extra things. You still might, you're still making other moves in the off season, but this would be one where it's not complicated. You could add him for hopefully a fair deal. So those are the pros, though. Maybe this is just because the other guys we've talked about are kind of shiny objects. It doesn't allure me as much as the others just for that reason.
Well, as it pertains to him skating around the Garden Ice with the cup, I guess all the Bruins fans would need to know is that he knows how to win. And you know what? Yeah, it's not a visual people will love to remember, but well, Bruins should have done something about it then. It speaks to the player. He was a massive reason why that team won a Stanley Cup. Massive. He was their number one center. He outplayed Bergeron when it mattered most. And this is not me bashing Bergeron. Like, objectively, he outplayed Bergeron in that series. And in that game 7. Now, yeah, like you don't have to trade for him. He's a free agent. As it is with all free agents, the question is, does he want to go there? Does he want to go to Boston? And I'm not sure. I'd be surprised if Boston's where he would choose to go. I just don't think that they can offer him the most money. And but yeah, I think he's a good. If it were a fair deal, as you mentioned, Bridget, and it makes it makes sense term wise, value wise, go for it. I do think I don't know if it's the Viking beard that makes him seem like he's a lot older than he is. When you say he's 32, it's yeah. I mean, that's young. That is not a he's
I
arguably
believe Charlie Coyle is 31, might be 32. So
yeah. Well, I mean, when the Bruins went to the finals a couple years ago, right? Bergeron was what, 36 or 35 at that time, right? I mean, O'Reilly's 32 is even in the NHL in a young man's league. It's not. That's totally still like back half prime. So yeah, I like O'Reilly obviously, and if it makes sense for both sides, then I would be for that for sure. It's definitely more of a known commodity. I think you mentioned the shiny toys, Bridget, being Dubois, Lindholm, Scheifele, maybe even, but I don't know if you're even referring to him. But like at least with O'Reilly, you definitely kind of you're getting that two-way prideful play that you mentioned. He plays with his heart on his sleeve and does what it takes, and you would never have to question his effort or his heart or leadership. And you can't say the same about some of the other guys that we mentioned. Obviously, Lindholm, we kind of like Lindholm, but he's O'Reilly's intangibles are a certainty, and of course he's still at an age where he can produce, especially with good players around him. So unlike the last player we're going to mention is a complete unknown. But
before we get to him, one last thing on O'Reilly. So Evolving Hockey projects his deal to be 3 years, $5.5 million a year, which seems very fair to me, honestly. Like that's a deal I would be okay with signing Ryan O'Reilly to. The thing is that's like the same AAV we've talked about with Tyler Bertuzzi, and we've talked about what you have to do to free up money to keep Bertuzzi, likely trading away at least one of Hall or Ullmark and, all that. So now if you're just straight up substituting O'Reilly in for Bertuzzi and letting Bertuzzi go, or you're, trading the other big guy, whether it's Hall or Ullmark, and now you're trading both of them to free up enough money. So a lot of complications to, even sign O'Reilly to that, which again, is a fair deal, but it's going to be really tough for the Bruins to, if there's any sort of bidding war, they just don't have the cap space to compete and to get into that. So, they could find a way to make it happen, but it can mean not re-signing Bertuzzi. So I don't know if that's something people would be okay with. If Bergeron and Krejci both retire, center's clearly a bigger need, but Bertuzzi's also younger and I don't know. Like, would people be okay with that trade-off?
As we get through the logistics of all of these, though, did you notice that it would so help your team? Like, this just goes to the point we were making last podcast. For all of the reasons we've explained, as each of these players come up as to why it would be difficult for them to add them, the biggest problem solver is Bergeron coming back. Like, it should be more clear if we weren't clear last time why, all of these details. Maybe this lays it out a little bit easier for everyone to see why Bergeron is the best solution before we go into what we're talking about here.
Yeah, exactly. And as you're saying that, if you're management, it's another reason why the Bruins losing in round 1 the way they lost is so frustrating, because the players aren't dumb. They very, very well know and knew what gamble management took for them to go all in this past season. The Bruins players knew that they'd be carrying $4.5 million of bonus overage into next season because of Bergeron and Krejci, and of course wanting those guys to be a part of that team last year. And while picking the Bruins against the field to win the cup, of course, is like, you can realistically say like they hoped that they would win the cup, but at least if they went on a deep run, you could justify like, man, like to go out in the first round and have to to have to deal with these bonus overages next year. And it's kind of a slap in the face to management, like, really, because like they stuck their neck out for these guys to give them the best chance they could, knowing that it would hinder them next year against the cap. And the players knew that. And it's just like, in addition to like just everything, it's what makes the way they bowed out this past season so frustrating. But it's the reality of the situation. And Bridget, you mentioned it. Yeah, Bergeron coming back. And look, I think Krejci is definitely a wild card, more so than, I borderline think Krejci's like already done. Like, I would be blown away if he came back. I think Bergeron still wants to keep going. And I also think he, like, one thing that like you won't hear from Boston media is like Bergeron very much like wants to help management post his transition. I really think that like he recognizes the situation that they're in, and I think buying time might be the wrong term, because I think he still wants to play, but like I think he's gonna yet again be a team player here and come back next year and help them for one more year and just try to figure out who's going to be after him. I'd be surprised if he left them with Coyle and Zacha. And that's not to say Bergeron like owes them anything. I'm just saying, like, I just think he's gonna do that for them again. So I do think he'd be the guy to come back.
Even if not for management, for his teammates, that he, obviously has really close relationships with these guys, in particular, Brad Marchand over the years, who he's been with for a long time. So,
and Marchand threatening to retire if Bergeron retires. I don't know if people saw this, but Marchand was at an event with friend of the pod, Andrew Raycroft, Sunday Skate co-host. Razor was like moderating it and asking Marchand questions, and Marchand at one point said, like, if Bergeron retires, I retire. And he's joked about that in the past, so I'm assuming he's joking again. But it's like, all right, stop saying that, Brad. Like, you don't want to hear that joke too many times, because then you just have to go like, could he actually be serious about that? I don't think he is. But
I've had people ask me this week, like, was that just offhanded as a joke, or was there more to that? I think it was a joke, but he's a funny guy, that guy.
What is he? A clown? He's there to amuse you?
Yeah, he is. He's like a jester.
Funny how?
No, Henry, he's a big boy. What do you say? Yeah, I think it was totally in jest. I think he's Marchand's not going anywhere. I mean, certainly not out of the league for sure. He's what, 35, 30, 34, 35?
Yeah.
No, he's not retiring. He was just kidding. Obviously there was a question about on this podcast, like, if Bergeron retires, do you try to sell high on the guy? But we already answered that question last week, and we're not going to go down the hole again. But as far as him retiring,
go back and watch it or listen to it.
Mm-hmm.
It's available
right here. Okay, so there was one other play. Do we want to touch on the last play just to cover all the tracks? I know, Bridget, we're just over an hour at this point, but we might as well talk about the last player. It is a fun one.
Let's go for it.
Shane Wright with the Seattle Kraken, the number 4 overall pick last summer. So I'll preface this by saying I don't think there's any chance this happens, but I really like this idea. It was from Steve Conroy of the Boston Herald. I actually read about this a couple of weeks ago, but we haven't really touched on it yet. It's a creative idea. This is the season for creativity. Basically, he built a trade. His idea is like to build it around Jeremy Swayman going the other way, which makes some sense because the Kraken have Philip Grubauer signed, but other than like a good round this postseason, Grubauer's been has really underperformed out there. So you could see why they would maybe want a young goalie. And Shane Wright had kind of a weird year where he started in the NHL, but wasn't playing every game. Like he was a healthy scratch a bunch, then went to the AHL, then back to the OHL, and then finished in the AHL playoffs. And points wise, like didn't put up the numbers you would expect, but he also was bouncing around so much that it was a really weird approach from the Kraken. I don't think they really needed to like pick a plan from the start of the year and let him go wherever he was going to go. And I don't think all the bouncing around helped him. But not saying, look, obviously, like if they made this trade, it's not that they're giving up on him. But if you still believe like he's a number 1 center of the future, then there's no way the Kraken even think about trading him. I think they would have to be absolutely blown away because if I'm them, I'm still looking at saying like, okay, Matty Beniers is the rookie of the year this year in the NHL. I'm assuming he's going to win that in a week or two whenever that gets announced. And they're still looking at saying we can line up Beniers and Shane Wright as our top 2 centers for a decade plus. And that should be very exciting if you're the Seattle Kraken. I think from all the prospects experts that you read, like everyone still considers Shane Wright a very high-end prospect, even after a weird season. And those players they're harder to find. They're harder to find than goalies or pretty much any other position. So I can't see the Kraken seriously entertaining a trade. I can't see the Bruins blowing them away because in my mind, it would probably have to be Swayman plus more. But it's a really fun one to think about, and a good conversation starter from Steve Conroy.
Yeah, well, and Shane Wright was supposed to go first overall, was he not?
Yeah,
like he was projected to go first overall. He fell, and maybe that was poor drafting by the teams ahead of him. Montreal had the first pick. They decided not to take him, even though he was considered the top prospect in that draft. So it kind of makes me wonder, was there something that people were figuring out at the end there that, had him drop? He didn't even just drop to 2, he dropped to 4. So to a chance to get a franchise center, you'd think you might want to jump on him as a prospect. But to your point about why they wouldn't want to get rid of him, how often do you get the chance to pick a center that high? Like the Bruins, they would love a center that came, one of the top centers, the top center in his draft, according to the projections, right before the draft. So he's a guy that you'd kind of be stupid to pass up on. Talking about Seattle, like you'd be stupid to punt on him just because of what happened last season. I'm sure they were probably thrilled that he fell to them there, and you got more than you probably even expected out of that draft. Of the issues with Seattle, he could be a long-term solution for them, unless they've seen like something crazy out of him, but it's still too early to tell. So if you think you know what you have, you're not dealing him.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like the Canadians passed on Shane Wright because they have the number one center of the future and current day in Nick Suzuki, and I think that they just
You
wanted
don't want
to get,
another one? You don't want another good center?
well, and no, I guess not. I guess they wanted to get a future 20 goal left winger instead because I don't think Slavkovsky's going to be anything more than and I'm not. I could be totally wrong here. I mean, maybe he's a 50 goal scorer in the future.
Yeah.
I personally, I see him being like a 15 to 25 goal guy in his prime. I don't see the skating chops that's required to score at the rate that Montreal thinks he might, but I could be wrong. As far as I'd have to go back at the couple teams after Montreal before Seattle, but regardless,
it looks like a really good draft after that. Like New Jersey took Simone Nemec, defenseman, who looks like a really good player. And then Arizona went Logan Cooley, who, if you redid the draft, might go number one overall now.
Yeah.
Taking Cooley over Wright, I don't think that's a mistake. Like that could definitely work out.
Well, in New Jersey has Heischer and Jack Hughes up the middle. So, but look, ultimately, I just echo what you guys said. I think that goaltending, while it's the most important position on the ice, right? Ironically, it's the most replaceable in my opinion. I mean, look at Vegas. Like does anybody honestly, does anybody know out there what Hill's first name is? Is it what's his first name?
Aiden.
All right.
That's us.
All right.
No,
and he's
it's Greg. It's Greg Hill.
It's he's like their fifth goalie this year in net. Like it's the most important position, but you can find goalies. You can't find like number one and number two centers as easily. It's just not out there. And I think, and to your guys' point, like, yeah, Seattle would be really dumb to gamble that away. And anyway, so I guess if you're asking if I would do it, I would do it in a heartbeat. I've already been on record saying like the Bruins should move one of all Marcus Swayman, and I would absolutely like, especially with like, and if it wasn't first of all, I like Bussy like down in Providence. I think, or is it Bussy or Bussy? Bussy. I think he's promising, but guess what? If it's not him, some other goaltender will come up the ranks and or be a free agent, or like somebody will come around. I mean, the Bruins won the Stanley Cup with who? Tim Thomas? When was he drafted? Oh, that's right. When was his first game with the Bruins? When he was like 30, and then like he came back 6 years later. Like, so my point is like, don't worry about getting the next Vasilevsky or Marty Brodeur or Patrick Waugh, because you know what? Like, those guys are few and far between, and most of the times the team that wins the cup doesn't have one of those guys, but they always have a number one and number two center. Well, both a number one and number two center, and I just think that I would take that gamble on Shane Wright for Swayman plus, but would Seattle? Probably not. So
no, basically what we just did was explain why Seattle would be stupid to do it, which should tell you that it'd be smart for the Bruins to try it. So yeah, and to go to the Jones and like back to the Jones and Mego conversation that we referenced last week, part of it was them wanting to have that turnover. They wanted to get rid of Bergeron, have that turnover. Well, this is a fresh face. Like, this is as far as you could get in terms of turnover for a number one center. This guy is coming in. This is a moldable guy that's still developing. So this is pretty much what they would be looking for. Not saying the Bruins could pull it off, but I think this would be what they were envisioning, this kind of a player to add.
Yeah. It would also be really fun. Like, talk about it, maybe injecting some life into Bruins Canadians rivalry again. Like, if the Bruins had the guy that the Canadians passed on, and I think like Shane Wright on draft night kind of stared down the Montreal table a little bit when they passed on him. So like, that'd be fun. You'd be able to compare them. If Wright ends up being a lot better than Slavkovsky, like, you rub that in Montreal's face every day. But again, I highly, highly doubt that Shane Wright's getting traded anywhere, much less to Boston.
All righty. Well, Bridget, Scott, any final thoughts? I think we've covered a really good topic today, and which would be the addressing the future at center potentially if Bergeron were to walk. I think ironically, I feel like the option that they would probably exercise is one that none of us talked about today, which would be they'll probably just run it with Coyle and Zacha,
which is like,
see what happens.
So that's what I've been saying is like probably the most likely option, because yeah, like they're gonna have to pay an arm and a leg to make any of these happen. So, yeah, it's definitely worth looking at. What are their options out there? Because Don Sweeney would be foolish not to be poking around and exploring all of these if they're on the table. But to explore it and then to actually pull it off and have the pieces to pull, to make one of these trades, like they're fighting an uphill battle because they don't have the cap space, they don't have the picks, and they don't have the prospects. And like that makes acquiring a number 1 or a number 2 center really difficult.
Go Bees.
All right. Is that finish it out for today, guys?
I think so. So.
Sign us off, Brian.
What's that?
Let's sign us off, Brian.
Yeah, time to hit the road, Jack. All right. Well, thank you all for listening, and we will talk to you very soon. Hey, guys, thanks for watching the Skate Podcast. If you want to see more of our videos, visit our playlist.
Not in front of a screen? You can listen to us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Don't forget to follow us on social media. And if you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to give us a thumbs up, subscribe